What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. To me, I think the metagame starts here. There have been a lot of innovations in the space of tech decks recently, and it might not be what you expect with the reversions to the tech cards. Those are actually not the ones that are seeing a ton of prominent play, because while they were gone, one of the things that a lot of people learned was just how effective Mercury, Mobius, and Juggernaut was as a core. Now, part of the reason those cards are so effective is the power of the things that they beat. Stardust was a pretty decent part of that core, but Stardust decks have not had nearly the staying power, or frankly, the actual power, or I should say decks that Stardust beats, as decks that Mercury beats. And Mercury might be a highly specific tech card, but the power of a deck like this is so massive that you kinda need it. This deck is so incredibly good at blanking other tech cards. Between Cosmo and Eliath, a reactive tech game plan just isn't going to cut it. So your proactive tech has to be in a bunch of different decks. Now, Mercury gets a lot of upside from just being a card that is basically Jeff the Baby Landshark with one less power, except it also beats the crap out of this deck. I still think this deck is unbelievably powerful. You just have to look out for the Mercuries. This deck does really, really strong stuff, and it is what defines the metagame in terms of when someone is asking, what's up with all these Mercury decks? This deck is the reason why it is that good. Interestingly, Move Bounce has become not necessarily a second-class citizen behind Big Move, but definitely has moved back in the pecking order of the Move decks. Big Move just fundamentally plays cards that are larger, right? And so you are a deck that is able to just play stats onto the board without having to make your cards work together in ways that are often jammed up by Mercury. Is it a great game plan? No. But is it better than what this deck does when it gets jammed up? A lot of the time, the answer is yes. Because when this deck gets jammed up, it's basically Sage, several question marks, and then you hopefully win the game. It's time to talk about the axis of evil. And this is going to be a fairly in-depth conversation. When I refer to the axis of evil, I'm talking about Mercury, Mobius, and Juggernaut, and I think arguably Thing First Steps, and again, arguably Ghost Spider. This is just sort of a baseline, ridiculously powerful core that you can build almost any point package around. You get to be whatever you want to be. You have all of this upside. You have all of these things that keep anyone from realistically going over the top of you. And the cards you're playing aren't that much worse than a normal card. So what's happened is largely that there's an arms race between these decks to find the dumbest point package to pair with that group of 3 to 5 to 6 cards, depending on how you think about Stardust. To me, this is representative of where we're at. This is not exactly a coherent deck. There's just a bunch of cards that, if you play them, are gonna be more points than the other people in the axis of evil. That's it. That's all this deck is trying to do. It is clunky 100%, but also it's gonna have more points than the other decks in the Mobius and, of course, Mercury space. And if you have more points in the Mobius Mercury space, well, guess whose Juggernaut is actually gonna work? Not your opponents, because you're filling up the board and also you have more points. That's really where we're at in terms of mid-range deck building. And there are so many different builds of the axis of evil that it is worth talking about them. This one came from Cougar. He's in the top 10 with it. I've been doing really well with it. It makes a ton of sense that the biggest version of this kind of deck is the one that you have to worry about. Of course, the originator of the axis of evil, and the only one of these decks that still commonly includes a Stardust, is the Invisible Woman First Steps deck. All of these decks are just asking the basic question of, wait a minute, don't we have a better point package than Invisible Woman First Steps to go in our 3 tech card and Ghost Spider and Thing First Steps deck? Yeah, You probably do. But that's not to say that Invisible Woman First Steps is that much worse than anything else. And weirdly, it is the one that is most able to afford having a tech card at 4 in it, because all of the other builds are using that space on Gwenpool and Mysterio and things like that. They're cutting that Stardust, which does open up opportunities for Stardust relevant decks to come back into the metagame, in my opinion. I think that could be a direction this metagame goes, because right now, these decks are shaving on tech in order to get bigger, but I kind of think it's impossible for them to shave on Mercury, to shave on Mobius at this point. I just don't think they have the ability to do it. So those are going to stay in the same spot, and it's really just going to be Stardust coming in and out of these decks. Quick honorable mention to this list from BigBaby. It is exactly the opposite of what I just said. We actually are cutting the Mobius. Nobody is legally allowed to cut Mercury in this metagame, but there are so many Mobiuses that people are a little bit afraid to do things that he beats. So there is some upside in doing that. I think this deck is pretty much sort of hyper metagamed against these mirrors by, again, cutting the power for cutting the tech card for more power. That is how these metagames tend to go. Eventually, these decks may get too inbred against each other and allow combos to come back in force. That has not happened yet, though. Last among the Axis of Evil, it's worth talking about the Hellion inclusion here. One of the things that you'll notice is that among top players, flexibility on the final turn of the game is extremely valuable, and this deck is built to optimize flexibility and also to provide points by using the move package. Again, same basic equation here going on. Look at my tech cards. They are the spine of the deck. We have 7 cards to play around with. What do I want to optimize for? I want points. I want flexibility. That's where this deck comes in. I think it gets pretty meaningfully stat checked by the Gwenpool stackers, though, so I'm not sure how much of a future this has. I have seen a pretty massive amount of Arishem recently, and I don't really know why. I don't think this deck is particularly amazing, but it is absolutely worth respecting. The reason you have to respect it is their snaps could be basically anything, and against those decks that are just a couple of tech cards and some good stats, Arishem can be in a good position if they're not really heavy on the synergy. The thing that determines the matchup between Invisible Woman First Steps decks or Gwenpool Mysterio decks and Arishem is not really up to Arishem, it's up to those decks. If they draw their synergy stuff, you're probably going to lose. You don't beat a Mysterio that's the size of a Doctor Doom. You just don't really do that. Now, there are things that Arishem can do in those games, and most of them involve Big Scammon, Cosmic Ghost Rider, Legion, whatever it is you feel like you're going to be scamming with. But it is not the ideal situation to be in, because there are these decks that have access to synergies that just go over the top of you a decent amount of the time. With Shang-Chi still seeing relatively low amounts of play, I think Sauron could be in a pretty good spot. If I'm not mistaken, this is actually Heart of the Cards lists, but if we're being honest, it's one card off the list we've been talking about for the past few weeks ever since Shang got nerfed in the first place. I see a lot of people messing around with bad cards in Sauron decks. And by that, I mean Nightmare, and I kind of mean Surtur. This is a deck that is not for those cards. It is for other cards. I would rather play a 3/10 than a 3/9 because that discounts my Scar. Now, yes, being a Scar deck when your opponent plays Mobius does kind of suck. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it doesn't. But the ability to have final turns where you could potentially do Scar, Ghost Spider, and one of Juggernaut or Negasonic, it's super messed up. It's a very powerful thing to have access to. And frankly, this deck can compete with any of the decks that are doing the Mercury Mobius stuff on points and likely come out ahead if it gets its positioning right. Victoria Hand deviates slightly from the Axis of Evil by not being a Juggernaut deck. It's just a good old-fashioned put some stats on the board deck, and I think that's a reasonable space for it to be in. I will say this, whenever I play with and against Victoria Hand, copy Victoria Hand or I don't care what you're doing. Like, there's a lot of that where it's like, if you're not copying Victoria Hands, I probably have a Mobius because I'm playing whatever garbagey mid-range deck. And you need to deal with that. Like, if you're not copying Victoria Hands, this deck is, like, not necessarily on the power level that you would want it to be. That's why we're going for the Moon Girl stuff here to really optimize for just going power to power with those decks. I think there is something here, but for a deck that I really expected to be just like far and away amazing, the best thing in the game, I do not think that Victoria Hand has lived up to that promise. I am a little bit surprised that she has consistently managed to be like, despite being like the second best deck in probably like half of the metagames for the last 6 months, she's just rarely actually been the best deck, no matter how many nerfs happen. And it's like, it's time for Victoria Hand to be the best deck. It's happened a couple times, but honestly less than you'd think. And I think that's interesting, notable, but largely this is just, wow, look at this deck that does points very efficiently. And it does do that. It's just like, that's also all it does. And there's a lot of decks in that space. I'm not overly enthused by Clug. Recently, a Debris Century Dormammu werewolf list has broken out. I use broken out in a bit like loosely, right? Like it's a list that I've seen more. I can't say I think it's all that amazing. There's unfortunately a fair bit of stuff that just is incidentally good against Clug. Merlin's running around. It's just really hard to beat a Merlin full stop. Like you can do it, but it requires some real priority management to make sure it actually happens. Merlin's really good against what this deck is trying to do. And even Mercury is just like, oh, well, I guess I'm not getting full clogged there. Like there's just kind of a lot that is just like, oh, yeah, no, it's not the greatest time to play Clug. Now, Clug is a strong enough strategy just like at baseline, right? Like the baseline thing Clug does is extremely, extremely absurdly powerful. And I don't want to downplay that. It is very powerful to attack your opponent's board space and their ability to play cards. It is the closest thing this game has to the concept of card advantage. And it is a fundamental part of the game that people need to understand. But there are enough things in the metagame that make queuing up this deck feel stupid that I think it's a little bit iffy right now. Cerebro's weird because it does not get tall enough to beat move, but it is still pretty solid into a variety of tech decks. But all of the tech decks have become thing first steps decks, and it's like, oh, you're playing the one card that can actually kill my Cerebro. It is weird, right? Like, I don't know how much of it is because of Cerebro. I know when I think about building thing first steps deck, it does come up in my thought process. Like, oh, at least this way I'm not 100% dead to Cerebro. I'm like, reasonably okay into it because Thing First Steps is a really, really cool card. Now, there's another conversation here about which Cerebro deck should be on here. I know Jay Walla's been playing, or preaching, I should say, C2 because it actually can play Mercury. I think that's a reasonable direction to go just because of how many tools it has against the current metagame. I think I've also seen, and I don't misconstrue this as an endorsement, but I've seen some C6 and it kind of just works. Like, I don't think it's the most amazing thing, but I do kind of feel like, all right, C6, it's, they're like good cards in it in a way that like, I don't think necessarily elevates it past meme tier per se, but it's definitely like a little more real than you think it is, would be my guess. I debated pretty heavily which of the lists I wanted to put onto the tier list for the discard section. There's this list. There is a list by the member of the main Marvel Snap Discord, Zinrius, that goes super all in on being a Dakin deck, which I actually do think is pretty solid right now. And there is, of course, the Khonshu list. I have split the difference. We are not fully all in, but we are all in enough on this to be pretty damn big. And I think it's a pretty reasonable way to approach this kind of deck building process. It's pretty solid. It does some good points when it needs to do the good points. It's probably the best place to put a Bastion. I think it's been interesting watching Bastion go into different spots. It's good in C3, it's good here, and it just doesn't make the cut in Victoria Hand, I think. I think it's largely making that deck worse. So I think that is sort of where Bastion has come down, where it is probably the right call in these two decks and probably nowhere else, which is an interesting space for it to land, I gotta tell you. This deck is looking to copy Dakins, it's looking to copy Bullseyes, it's looking to copy Morbiuses, yes. But it does have a bit of the top taken off by the prevalence of Mobius. Because if you're copying Bullseyes, you're like, oh, I'm going to do a bunch of swarms. They're going to lose. And it's like, yeah, but you're not going to do that if they Mobius you. Okay, normally I would have Destroy somewhere towards the end of the tier list. But I'll be honest with you. Like, I think Destroy is better than that joke. I really, really actually do. I genuinely respect this deck. You can beat a lot of stuff going vertical with the good draws out of this deck. You have a lot of built-in snaps against the things that people are doing right now. The only thing you're really worried about, and it does matter, is you do not like seeing Juggernaut. So in order to beat Juggernaut, you basically just need to be able to say, like, I have so much power on all three lanes, it doesn't matter that I get Juggernauted to absolute crap on one of them. And that is possible, but wow, there's a lot of Juggernaut right now. Part of the reason this deck is getting better, in my estimation, is that there are just less Stardust decks in the Axis of Evil. We talked about that. And frankly, if you are looking at which deck is still playing Stardust, it's the Invisible Woman deck, which is the worst into Killmonger, and the one you are probably most happy to see because of that. So it sort of evens out. All the decks that are actually going to be able to do a bunch of points that are similar to your level of points on like a medium draw, those decks are not going to be able to play Stardust, and you can actually count on your guys that die like X-23 and Wolverine actually coming back onto the board. Mobius is another story. I don't think you can cut death with a straight face. I don't think you can do it, but it has occurred to me. Wiccan's in a weird spot where it's like all of the energy in being a mid-range deck is wrapped up in these Axis of Evil decks. That's where all the innovation is happening, right? And so what is a poor Wiccan gamer to do? Because it's hard for them to be a twos deck, which you need to be if you want to be a Mercury deck. And so if you're going to be a twos deck, it means you're not doing the domino stuff, which means you can't fit a lot of the top end stuff, and you need the top end stuff to compete on stats. So the only one you really get in there is Mobius, which, don't get me wrong, it's a good thing. But like when I talk about, I'm gonna probably talk about like Sera and Negative at some point, right? And spoiler alert, they're not on this tier list. It's not because they're actively bad. It's because of all of these tech cards, the one that every deck goes out of their way to fit is Mobius and Mobius. I'm not saying I think Mobius is at like 50% play rate or whatever, but I think we have hit the point where it's like, there is no good reason for that card to be a 3-4. I just don't think there's a good reason. They did the thing that they did with Shadow King way back in the day when Agent Venom was really good. They were like, let's buff Shadow King. They did that for Mobius. They were like, let's buff Mobius. It's going to be good into the Mr. Fantastics and Surges of the world. And then they nerfed Mr. Fantastic and Surge, but Mobius is still here with an extra point of power. And he is everywhere. And I kind of think that they should do something about that. On to a few fun builds that I think are pretty interesting and are from high infinite players. This is the anti-Arishem cook from Honifer. It is, I'll be honest with you, I think if you wanted to be anti-Arishem, you could also just play like a Quicksilver Wiccan version of the Darkhawk deck, and that would be perfectly acceptable in this metagame too, because there are way more Arishems than there should be. Like just 100%. That's the most honest I can be about it. There are too many people playing Arishem for how good the deck is. And as long as they continue to do that, you might as well just go ahead and collect your free wins. I don't feel like it's worth over-indexing for Arishem because I feel like basically every time I'm playing a mid-range deck with a modicum of synergy in it, I'm probably favored anyway. I don't want to go out of my way to be like the Arishem hater or whatever. But I know that there are tons of people who are watching this that would love to go out of their way to be the Arishem hater. And if you'd like to do that, Darkhawk Cassandra Nova is right there. This is my favorite iteration of Hella Enjoyer's Ladder Tribunal, and I think a discerning eye will be able to see why. It's because the deck is getting dumber and dumber. Like, I don't mean it's getting stronger and stronger. Dumb here is not a synonym for strength. It's a synonym for I'm a moron, and this is the easiest way to play it. I also did explore alongside Hella Enjoyer the idea of cutting Sera entirely because of the amount of Mobius for a blink. And I think that there are going to be people who are watching this who are like, KM, why aren't you doing that? You just talked about how Mobius is everywhere. Why are you playing a thing that loses to Mobius? Generally, the idea is basically because the blink line is so vulnerable to everything else. So when you're doing the blink line and setting up stuff like that, if your opponent's on the ball, what you're really setting up is one of those one-lane tribunals a lot of the time. And that means that they are able to Juggernaut that lane, they are able to Enchantress that lane, they're able to Rogue that lane. They have an idea of what you're doing, whereas Sera, as much as I hate to say it, does not provide them the same idea. And that is unfortunately quite relevant. I don't want to be playing Sera either, don't get me wrong, but we believe at this point it is probably still the best thing to do. Safety Blade's ongoing list should come with a warning sign. Maybe not the best idea to play if you are not Safety Blade himself. This is a fairly, how far removed is this from Axis of Evil? Not very. It's like, come on. We got the Mercury. We got the Mobius. You know the deal, right? Like, we're just really arguing over the stats here, you know? That's really all that's going on. And it's fine. I don't think it's the wrong thing to do. It's just like, I have such a noted preference for so many of the other cards, or so many of the other decks in the Axis of Evil space. And I do think that generally speaking, I'd rather be in that sort of camp. That said, if you are someone who does not own Thing First Steps and still wants to be an Axis of Evil gamer, I think this, traditional V-Hand, these are decks that are very, very viable. Here is Gamer's iteration of Scream. I have been seeing it run around top infinite, by which I mean I've been playing against Gamer, and I think this kind of has some legs. It might not have any legs once it gets out there, you know, my video might have something to do with that, but I do think it probably is a very viable way to build Scream. And the reason I'm putting this one on here is because you probably know what the normal Scream deck looks like already. There's nothing special about that one. You can happily go play it. But if you want to try something a little bit off the beaten path, I think this deck is actually quite interesting. Last up, Regis Kilbin did a video on this. I saw his tweet where he said this deck was like the third best deck post-infinite. To me, that's more of a warning sign about using post-infinite versus like using, you know, top 10% or whatever on Untapped. But I did check top 10% and it was still doing pretty decently. So I'm really putting this one on here as a way to say, hey, be aware that this is what's happening when you run into this. I don't have the largest amount of respect for this deck, but being realistic about what your options are, look, this is a deck from 2023. I'm not going to sit here and act like it's not, but it does do points in a meaningful way, and it does avoid getting absolutely hammered by the most common tech cards that you see, right? Like, this is a deck that does points and dodges the things everyone is playing. What are you going to do about my Destroyer? What are you going to do about my spread out power here? You are not going to have the amount of power that the person playing this deck, have access to. And I think that is like really relevant, right? Like, while everyone is focused on being like the best Mercury Mobius deck, if you abandon it, even shells like this are able to match the power. And I think that's relevant. I don't particularly expect this deck to continue succeeding at this level, but I do think it's worth pointing out that as long as you're willing to just write off the idea of ever beating Move or Mr. Negative or whatever and say other people are going to do that for me, you can police the police. Speaking of Mr. Negative and Sera, I did not include them on this tier list, and that is entirely down to Mobius. I just would not play them. That's really where I'm at. I would not be a Mr. Negative gamer. I would not be a Sera gamer. The decks aren't bad. It just isn't the time. I don't want this to be like a I think they're terrible or unplayable trash or anything like that, because I don't. I don't think they're terrible. I don't think they're unplayable trash. I just think that right now is not the time to be doing stuff that gets absolutely donged on by Owen Wilson. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.